The sky over Lone Mesa was a liar. It promised a cool, pale blue, but delivered nothing but heat. Ghost-white clouds drifted by, mocking the cracked earth below. They held no rain, not a single drop. Heat shimmered off the wagon ruts, turning the world into a wavy, drunken dream. The horizon looked like it was on fire, a slow, smoldering burn at the edge of the world. A dry wind whispered through the brittle grass, pushing grit against the weathered boards of the town saloon, making the sign creak and moan like a dying man. Dust was a plague. It was in your mouth, in your hat, in your lungs. It was the taste of this land, a taste of endings. Crawling along the narrow track that led away from town, away from the whispers and the pity, was a single wagon. Its wheels groaned a complaint with every turn. The mule pulling it was slick with sweat, tossing its head to fight off flies that didn't seem to mind the heat. On the driver's seat sat a woman. Her back was as straight as a rifle barrel, defying the years that had bent so many others. Her name was Josephine Carver. Her dress was a patchwork of fading colors, her bonnet a ghost of what it once was. But her face, etched with lines of sun and sorrow, held a stillness, a deep calm. It was the face of a woman who had seen the bottom and learned to stand on it. Her hands on the reins were maps of a hard life, veined and strong. She had driven farther than most folks could even imagine, leaving behind nothing but ghosts and unpaid bills. She knew what they said about her back in town. The words ran faster than her tired mule. A widowed drifter, they'd whisper over warm beer, too old for real work but too damn proud to beg. She didn't care. She kept her eyes on what was ahead. The land rose and fell in slow, patient waves, and at the very edge of it all stood a ranch house. It was broad and timbered, its roof a sharp, dark line against the pale, unforgiving sky. The McGraw place, Colton McGraw, a man who owned more land and cattle than God, they said. A man built like an old oak and just as silent. A man who had lost his wife and buried his heart with her. He was leaning against the fence when Josephine's wagon finally rattled off the main track. He was tall, so tall he made the gate beside him look like a toy. His shoulders were bowed, not in weakness, but from the sheer weight of work. Wind and grief had carved his face into a mask of hard lines. His hat cast a deep shadow over his eyes, but you could see the set of his jaw. It was the jaw of a man who stood alone because he'd forgotten how to stand with anyone else. Two young ranch hands stopped their work to watch her approach. One was Wyatt Buckner, red-haired and quick with a stupid grin. The other was Hank Dulon, lanky and restless, his eyes always darting around like a nervous bird. Josephine pulled the mule to a halt. The dust settled around her in a lazy, golden cloud. She didn't move for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, she climbed down from the wagon. Her bones ached, but she didn't let it show. She walked right up to the gate. "Mr. McGraw," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. It was a voice that didn't waste a single breath. "I'm old, sir, but I can cook." Wyatt let out a snort before he could stop himself. Hank shot him a look and elbowed him in the ribs, but a smirk still played on his lips. Colton McGraw said nothing. He just stood there, his shadowed eyes taking her in. The patched dress, the straight spine, the gaze that met his and didn't waver. He seemed to look right through her, weighing something she couldn't see. Finally, his voice came, slow and even, like rocks grinding together. "Ain't easy work here." "I've done hard work all my life," Josephine said, her voice never changing. "I don't need easy. I need honest." The wind picked up, teasing the brim of her bonnet, carrying the scent of dry sage and secrets. Colton shifted his weight. He glanced toward the big, silent house, then back at her. "You ride alone?" he asked. "I do." "Why?" The question was sharp, a probe looking for a weak spot. Her hands folded at her waist. It wasn't a gesture of prayer. It was a shield. Because there's no one left to ride with. Something flickered in Colton's hidden eyes, a shadow moving fast across a field. But his voice stayed cold. Plenty of younger folks looking for work. You'd be better off in town. I was in town, Josephine said, the words plain, simple, and heavy. Town said no. The grin on Wyatt's face vanished. Hank suddenly found the toes of his boots incredibly interesting. The world seemed to hold its breath. Colton let out a long, slow sigh. He turned his back to her and faced the ranch house. "Come on," he said over his shoulder. "We'll talk." The kitchen was cool and dark, a cave built of thick timber. A massive iron stove sat cold and silent, like a dead god on its altar. Josephine's eyes moved over everything. The bare shelves, the stacked sacks of flour and beans, the sink that looked like it hadn't been properly scrubbed in a decade. This was a house lived in by men. Men who worked the land until they were exhausted, then fell into bed without a thought for the four walls around them. It was a place without a soul. She ran a single finger along the dusty countertop, leaving a clean, stark line in the grime. It was a declaration. I am here. You'd rise before dawn. Colton's voice came from behind her. He didn't startle her. She'd felt his presence, a heavy weight in the room. Cook for 8 men, sometimes more. Bake bread, keep things in order, long days, long nights. She just nodded, her eyes still on the stove. I can do it. You'll have a room out back, he said. He was studying her face now, searching for a crack, for any sign of doubt. Pay ain't much. I'm not asking for much. He stared at her for another long, silent moment. She could feel him turning it all over in his head, the risk, the strangeness of it all. An old woman, alone, showing up at his gate with nothing but a tired mule and a straight spine. Finally, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Start tomorrow. A knot inside Josephine's chest, a knot she hadn't even realized was there, loosened just a fraction. She held her face perfectly still, refusing to show the tidal wave of relief that washed over her. Thank you, she said. By nightfall, the news had traveled on the wind all the way back to town. In Sadie Bell's saloon, glasses clinked and laughter rang out, sharp and mean. He hired her, Sadie said, her painted eyebrows climbing toward her hairline. She was a woman who owned the room, her voice a mix of honey and venom. Old Joe Carver. Can you believe it? Colton McGraw's finally lost his mind, or maybe his heart's gone soft. The men at the bar howled. Someone muttered it was desperation. Someone else called it charity. Sadie leaned on the polished bar, shaking her head, a knowing, cruel smile on her face. He's got no use for company, never has. She won't last a month. But Josephine didn't hear them. She was walking the narrow path to the small shack that was now hers. The door groaned in protest but held. Inside, there was a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a chipped washstand, and a single hook on the wall for her shawl. It was nothing, but it was something. She sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress sighing under her small weight, and let her hands fall into her lap. It wasn't comfort, but it was a roof. It wasn't a home, but it was a start. As the last light of day bled from the sky, she unpacked her single small trunk. She moved with a purpose that defied the exhaustion in her bones. She wasn't just unpacking clothes, she was digging for something. Buried beneath layers of worn fabric, her fingers found a small, leather-bound book, a journal. Tucked inside was a faded photograph, a young woman with a smile that could break your heart. A woman with Colton McGraw's eyes. Josephine stared at the picture, her face a mask of iron control. This wasn't just about a job. This wasn't about survival. This was a reckoning. That night, Colton stood on his porch, hat in his hands, staring out at the darkness. From the corner of his eye, he could see a faint light in the window of the old shack. He saw the silhouette of the woman moving inside. Her back, even in shadow, was still ramrod straight. The sight stirred something in him, a memory he kept buried deep. The smell of baking bread on a cold morning. The soft rustle of a dress moving through a quiet house, the ghost of a laugh. He shook his head, trying to banish the ghosts. He turned back to the dark pastures, where his cattle shifted like shadows under the rising moon. He was a man who preferred the company of beasts to the company of people. But tonight, for the first time in a long, long time, he wasn't entirely alone. And that feeling, it was as terrifying as it was welcome. Dawn was a whisper. Josephine was up before it, coaxing a flame to life in the belly of the iron stove. The kitchen was her sanctuary, her battlefield. She moved with the quiet efficiency of a soldier preparing for war. She ground coffee beans by hand, the rhythmic scraping of metal on metal, a prayer in the dim light. Soon, the rich, bitter scent of coffee filled the air, chasing away the ghosts of the cold night. By the time the sky turned a bruised, blushing pink, golden biscuits were rising in the oven, and a pot of oats simmered on the stove, sweetened with a bit of molasses she'd found hidden away like a secret. The kitchen, once cold and dead, was now alive. It breathed with warmth and the smell of honest labor. The ranch hands stumbled in one by one like bears waking from a long sleep. Wyatt was first, his red hair a tangled mess, sleep still clinging to his eyes. Then Hank, his long frame ducking under the low doorway. They both stopped dead when the smell hit them. Wyatt let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, grabbing a biscuit and taking a bite so fast the steam made him hiss. Hank didn't say a word, but he gave a slow, deliberate nod of approval, a high compliment from a man of so few words. Josephine ignored them. She simply set more plates on the table, her movements fluid and precise. She wasn't looking for praise. She was establishing her territory. Colton was the last to arrive. He filled the doorway, a mountain of a man smelling of horse and dust and the coming day. His eyes, shadowed and unreadable, swept the room. They took in the clean counters, the simmering pots, the plates of food, and then they landed on her. He didn't speak. He just took a biscuit, broke it in half with his powerful hands, and ate. But the silence in the room had changed. It was no longer empty. It was filled with a new kind of quiet, a quiet that held weight. Josephine didn't look at him, but she felt his gaze. It was an appraisal, a test, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she had passed. After the men had gone, their boots scuffing on the porch, their voices lower and less mocking than the day before, Josephine began her real work. She scrubbed the kitchen with a fierce reverence. She attacked the years of grime on the counters until the faint grain of the wood began to show through. She polished the tarnished brass on the stove door until it gleamed like gold. She took down the stale, yellowed curtains and washed them in a bucket of lye soap, hanging them out in the sun to bleach. Each scrub, each polish, each small act of care was a claim. This is mine. By mid-morning, the kitchen no longer smelled of dust and neglect. It smelled of soap and coffee and a fragile, blooming hope. She found a loose floorboard near the hearth. Prying it up with the tip of a knife, she stared down into the small, dark space beneath. It was empty. Of course it was empty. It wouldn't be that easy. But it was a start. A place to look. The outside world, however, was not so easily cleansed. Her first trip to town for supplies was a trial by fire. The usual vultures were perched on the saloon porch, and their queen, Sadie Bell, was holding court. She leaned against the doorway, her dark hair piled high, her eyes as sharp and predatory as a hawk's. "Well, well," she called out, her voice dripping with syrupy poison as Josephine climbed down from the wagon. "Look what the wind blew in. McGraw's got himself a new mammy." Laughter rippled through the men around her. Josephine kept her chin high and her eyes straight ahead, walking toward the mercantile. But she could feel their stares, hot and heavy on her back. Inside the store, the clerk, a weaselly man with a twitchy mustache, paused before handing over the sack of flour she'd asked for. "You settling in out there for long?" he asked, his voice casual but his eyes full of sly curiosity. "As long as the work lasts," Josephine answered, her voice even. He gave a knowing smirk. "Work don't last long for folks who can't keep up, especially not for outsiders." The word hung in the air between them, thick and ugly. On her way back to the wagon, Sadie's voice floated out from the saloon again, loud enough to carry. "She's chasing a ghost, she just don't know it yet." More laughter followed. Josephine's hands trembled on the reins, but she refused to look back. She clucked to the mule and drove on, letting the vast, empty prairie swallow the sound. That night, Colton found her stacking firewood by the back door. Her sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong, sinewy arms, and a few strands of gray hair had escaped their pins, softening the harsh lines of her face. He didn't say anything about town, about the gossip. Maybe he hadn't heard, or maybe, more likely, he simply chose not to. "Storm's coming tomorrow," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Keep extra water drawn." She nodded, grateful for the simple, practical words. It was a language she understood. But as he turned to leave, the words spilled out of her before she could stop them. "The town doesn't want me here." He stopped, his back still to her. "Town doesn't feed you. I just—" Her throat felt tight. "I've lost enough. I don't want to lose this too." He stood there for a long moment, his shoulders rigid. The silence stretched, filled only by the chirping of crickets and the vast emptiness of the prairie night. Then, without another word, he walked away. The silence wasn't cruel. It was just empty. The silence of a man who had nothing left to give, who had built walls so high he'd forgotten how to open the gate. Josephine watched him go, a cold knot of despair tightening in her chest. She was on her own. She had always been on her own. The storm came with the dawn, a furious, violent beast. Rain lashed against the roof, and the wind howled like a banshee. Josephine spent the morning in a frantic battle against the elements, securing shutters, moving sacks of flour away from leaking walls. A seam in the kitchen roof finally gave way, a steady drip, drip, drip onto the floor. She dragged a rickety chair over, climbed on top, and started patching the hole with a piece of oiled cloth, cold rainwater running down her arms and back. Suddenly, a pair of strong hands gripped the back of the chair, steadying it. It was Colton. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, his presence a solid anchor in the chaos. They worked in silence, a strange, unspoken partnership. He held a new beam in place while she hammered nails, her hands trembling but determined. Lightning lit up the dark kitchen, flashing across his face, revealing the deep-set lines, the tight jaw, the unwavering focus in his eyes. Thunder rolled, shaking the very foundations of the house. In one of those brilliant, fleeting flashes, she looked down and met his gaze. There was no pity there, no judgment. There was only a quiet, grudging respect. When the storm finally blew past, leaving a drenched and glittering world in its wake, they were both soaked to the bone. The silence in the kitchen was profound. Colton handed her a dry towel. It was an awkward, unpracticed gesture, but it was sincere. "You're tougher than you look," he said, his voice rough. "I've had to be," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper against the patter of the last raindrops. Something shifted between them then, something fragile and new. He didn't smile, not really, but the hard line of his mouth softened for a fraction of a second before he turned and walked out the door, leaving her shivering, not just from the cold, but from the first glimmer of a connection she never expected to feel again. In the days that followed, small things began to change. One evening she found the broken latch on her shack door had been fixed. Another morning, a perfectly chopped pile of kindling was waiting for her by the kitchen step. She never saw him do it. There were no words exchanged. But she knew. In return, she started leaving an extra slice of honey-drizzled cornbread on his plate. She found his work shirt, torn at the elbow, and mended it so neatly the seam was almost invisible. These were not grand gestures. They were the quiet language of two lonely souls, speaking in a dialect of small kindnesses. The ranch hands noticed, too. The smirks and whispers had vanished, replaced by a quiet respect. "Need anything hauled, ma'am?" Wyatt would ask, his face flushing red. Hank would just tip his hat, a gesture that spoke volumes. But kindness inside the ranch only seemed to fuel the cruelty in town. When Josephine went for supplies again, Sadie Bell was waiting for her. She didn't shout this time. She stepped right in front of Josephine, blocking her path. Her voice was low, a venomous hiss meant only for her. "Men like McGraw, they don't keep company," she whispered, her eyes glittering with a strange fire. "They just use people up. Don't you go thinking you're special. He doesn't need anyone, especially not some broken-down old crow." The words were like tiny, poisoned needles. All around them, other shoppers paused, their ears pricked up, their eyes hungry for the drama. Josephine felt her face flush with heat. Her heart pounded in her ears. She grabbed her parcels and practically fled, not stopping until she was miles out of town, the prairie swallowing her whole. That night, she didn't just cry. She sobbed. Alone in her small, dark room, she let the grief and the shame and the loneliness pour out of her, muffling the sounds in her coarse pillow. The town was right. She was a foolish old woman chasing a ghost, just like Sadie had said. A ghost in a faded photograph. She was too old, too tired, too broken to believe she could ever matter to anyone again. But even as the tears fell, she thought of Colton's hands steadying the chair in the storm. She thought of Wyatt's shy smile. She thought of the warm, living kitchen she had created from dust and neglect. They were small things, but maybe, just maybe, they were enough. The next morning, she was in the kitchen before dawn, her eyes swollen, but her spine straight. She would not be broken. She would not run. When Colton came in for breakfast, he stopped in the doorway. He looked at her face, really looked at her, and she knew he saw the ravages of her tears. He didn't ask. He didn't say a word. He just held her gaze for a moment longer than usual before taking his seat. And in that silent, steady look, she felt something more powerful than pity. She felt acknowledgement. She felt respect. And she realized, with a sudden fierce clarity, that her worth wasn't decided in a saloon full of whispers. It was being forged right here, in the fire of the stove and the silence of a broken man's gaze. Summer deepened, turning the prairie into a sea of brittle golden grass. The heat was relentless. Josephine's days fell into a rhythm that was as punishing as it was comforting. Rolling dough before sunrise, tending simmering pots in the sweltering afternoon, mending torn shirts by the faint light of a kerosene lamp. The work was hard, honest, and in its endless repetition, she found a kind of peace. But every trip to town was like picking at a scab, reopening the wound of being an outcast. Each time she had to fight the urge to just keep riding, to disappear back into the vast, indifferent wilderness she'd come from. One scorching afternoon, she was standing by the back door, trying to catch a breath of air that wasn't thick with heat, when Colton rode in from the fields. He was covered in dust, his face grim with exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp. He stopped his horse and looked down at her. "You thinking of quitting?" he asked, his voice quiet. The question caught her off guard. "No," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "Not yet." He swung down from his horse, his movements stiff. He stared out at the horizon, his jaw tight as if he were wrestling with the words. "Don't let them decide what you're worth," he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. She just stared at him, stunned into silence. He didn't wait for a reply. He was already walking toward the barn, his broad shoulders set against the dying light. It wasn't kindness, not the soft kind. It was something harder, something better. It was permission, permission to fight. That night, long after the house was dark and silent, Josephine sat by her window, watching the moon rise over the prairie. Her body ached, but beneath the ache, something new was stirring, a stubborn little flame of hope. She didn't know that on the porch of the main house, Colton McGraw was doing the same thing, staring at the faint, flickering light from her window. A faint scent of baking bread and rain-soaked wood drifted on the night air, and for the first time since his world had ended, he felt the cold, empty shell of his house begin to feel just a little bit like a home again. He went inside, to the room at the back of the house, the one that was always locked. He turned the key and stepped inside. It was a woman's room, preserved perfectly, but covered in a fine layer of dust. On the bedside table was a silver locket. He picked it up, his thumb brushing over the engraving. Lila. He opened it. Inside, there wasn't a picture. There was a tiny folded piece of paper. He didn't read it. He already knew what it said. It was a warning. And he knew, with a sinking feeling, that the storm Josephine was worried about had nothing to do with the weather. The summer held its breath, the air growing thick and heavy with unspoken warnings. The days were deceptively calm, but by afternoon, the edges of the sky would turn a bruised, angry purple, and thunder would murmur in the distance like a restless giant. Josephine felt the change in the air, a pressure in her bones that told her something was coming. She was kneading bread one afternoon when the light in the kitchen shifted, turning a strange, sickly yellow. Outside, the wind began to rise, not a gentle breeze, but a nervous, agitated force that whipped the tall grass into a frenzy. The air smelled of rain and metal and something else. Fear. She moved with a quiet, practiced urgency, shuttering the windows, pulling the laundry from the line. Wyatt and Hank came galloping in from the lower pastures, their faces grim, shouting something about a downed fence, but their words were stolen by a sudden, violent gust of wind that sent a cloud of dust swirling through the yard. Josephine saw the panic in the mule's eyes. She ran to the shed, grabbing its halter, her voice a low, calming murmur as she led the terrified animal inside. As she latched the door, a single cold drop of rain hit her cheek, then another. Then the sky opened up, and the rain came down not in drops, but in a solid, gray sheet. Lightning tore the sky in two, followed by a crack of thunder so close it shook the ground beneath her feet. She ran for the house, her skirts heavy with water, plastering themselves to her legs. Halfway across the yard, she saw him. Colton, riding in hard, his hat pulled low, his body a dark silhouette against the storm. He didn't slow down. His horse churned through the mud, its eyes wide with fear. His gaze swept the yard, assessing, calculating. When he saw her wrestling with the last, stubborn shudder, he was off his horse in a single, fluid motion, striding toward her without a word. The world shrank to the two of them, the wind and the rain. He braced the heavy wooden shutter with his body while she hammered the nails, her hands slick and trembling. Each crash of thunder was a physical blow. Each flash of lightning illuminated his face, a mask of grim determination. Rain streamed from the brim of his hat, soaking her hair, her face, her dress. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. "Hold it! Got it!" It was a desperate, primal dance against the fury of the storm. When the last nail was secure, they stumbled inside, breathless and soaked. The kitchen smelled of wet earth and rising bread. For a long moment, they just stood there, dripping on the floor, the sound of their own harsh breathing filling the sudden, shocking quiet. "You work hard," he said finally, his voice hoarse. She looked up at him, surprised by the words. "It's what keeps me alive," she said. He studied her then, his gaze intense. It wasn't pity she saw in his eyes. It was something else, something deeper. Most folks quit before the hard part's done. Most folks, she said, the words slipping out raw and unfiltered, haven't had to start over at my age. Shame flickered in her heart, but she didn't take it back. Some truths had to be spoken. A flicker of something that looked like pain crossed his face. Starting over is no small thing, he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. He looked like he wanted to say more, but the words wouldn't come. He never had many words. But the ones he chose, they landed like stones in a still pond, the ripples spreading out in the silence. That night, the storm raged on. Josephine lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the rain hammer on the roof and the wind howl at the walls. For years, she had been alone, truly alone. But now, knowing that another soul was awake under the same roof, a man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and hadn't turned away, it felt strange, almost tender. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The sky was a brilliant, aching blue. Colton was already out, checking the fences. Wyatt and Hank sloshed through the mud, their good-natured cursing a familiar sound. Josephine brought them steaming mugs of coffee, a small, wordless offering. Wyatt gave her a wide, grateful grin. Hank, surprisingly, spoke. "Storm didn't scare you off, then?" "It takes more than a little wind to scare me," she said. He chuckled, a low, respectful sound. Later, as she hung out the wet laundry, she overheard them talking by the barn. "Told you she was tough," Wyatt was saying. "Cooked right through it all. Didn't even flinch." Josephine felt her throat tighten. Respect. It was a currency she had almost forgotten the value of, but the town hadn't forgotten its cruelty. A few days later she rode in for supplies, and Sadie Bell was there, a spider waiting in her web. Her smile was sweeter than ever, which only made it more poisonous. "Back for more?" she asked, her voice light and airy. "Colton keeping you busy?" "There's plenty to do," Josephine said, her face a calm mask. Sadie leaned in close, her perfume cloying, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A word of advice. Careful you don't mistake work for welcome. He's a broken man. He doesn't need anyone to fix him, and he will destroy anyone who tries." A ripple of snickers went through the men on the porch. The words hit their mark, lodging deep in Josephine's heart. She finished her shopping in a daze, her hands trembling so badly she could barely count out the coins. The ride home was a blur of misery. The prairie seemed to stretch on forever, a monument to her own loneliness. That evening she found Colton by the corral, mending a broken gate. She hesitated. Then the words tumbled out. "Do you ever hear what they say about me? About you?" He didn't look up from his work. "Town's always talking." "They think I don't belong here," she pushed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Maybe they're right." He straightened up then, slowly, and turned to face her. The setting sun cast him in silhouette, a giant carved from shadow. "They don't know you," he said simply. "Maybe I don't know me anymore either," she whispered. His gaze held hers, steady and unwavering. "You know how to stand when it's hard," he said. "That's enough." The breath left her body in a rush. No one had said anything like that to her in a lifetime. Gratitude and a deep aching sorrow warred inside her, and all she could do was nod. He gave the smallest tilt of his head before turning back to his work, but his words wrapped around her like a warm blanket against the coming chill. Their connection deepened after that, not in words, but in quiet rituals. He started lingering at the breakfast table, nursing a cup of coffee while she washed the dishes. Sometimes he'd sit on the porch steps in the evening, mending tack, his silent presence a shield against the vast emptiness. She, in turn, began to anticipate his needs, leaving a jar of cool water for him by the barn, stitching a tear in his favorite shirt before he even noticed it was there. One blistering afternoon, she saw him riding in from the far range, a small, solitary figure in a sea of shimmering heat. When he dismounted, he looked over at her where she stood by the clothesline, and he tipped his hat. It wasn't the casual nod he gave to strangers. It was a slow, deliberate gesture of acknowledgement, a silent message that passed between them. I see you, but every kindness on the ranch seemed to breed a new strain of poison in town. Wyatt came back from the saloon one evening looking troubled. He hesitated, then told her what he'd heard. The whispers had grown teeth. Now they were saying she was a schemer, a gold digger, aiming to marry her way into the McGraw fortune, that she was using an old woman's wiles to trap a grieving man. The words were ugly, and Wyatt's shame in repeating them was obvious, but they still hit their mark. That night, a cold, quiet fury burned in Josephine's heart. Fury at the town, at her age, at the world that tried so hard to grind her down. She stepped out onto the porch, needing to breathe air that wasn't thick with bitterness. The prairie was bathed in silver moonlight, vast and indifferent. She thought of her daughter, Lila. She thought of the letter she'd received, the one that had sent her on this impossible journey. A letter full of fear and a single, cryptic clue. The locket is the key. He doesn't know. She didn't hear the screen door open behind her. Colton's voice made her jump. Storm's coming again, he said softly. She turned. He was standing closer than she expected, close enough to see the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the guarded kindness that he couldn't quite hide. I'm not afraid of storms, she replied. A corner of his mouth twitched, the ghost of a smile. Didn't think you were. They stood in silence for a long time, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the distant rumble of thunder. For the first time, the space between them didn't feel like a chasm. It felt possible. When he finally turned to go, he paused in the doorway. You've made this house different, he said, his back to her. His voice was so quiet, she almost missed it. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to ask him how, wanted to hear him say the words. But before she could speak, he stepped inside, leaving her alone with the echo of his words and the vast, waiting prairie. She wasn't chasing a ghost. She was hunting a killer. And she was getting closer. The cruelest stretch of summer arrived, bleaching the prairie to the color of old bones. The sun was a hammer, and the dust was a constant, choking presence. An unspoken tension settled over the ranch, thick and heavy as the humid air. The cattle were restless. There were rumors of strange riders spotted in the distant gullies. Wyatt found tracks near the watering hole that belonged to no one he knew. Hank swore that calves were going missing in the night. Colton grew even more silent, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He started carrying his rifle with him everywhere, a grim extension of his arm. One evening, as Josephine was kneading dough in the quiet kitchen, she heard their voices from the porch, low and urgent. They're out there, Colton, Wyatt said. I can feel it. They'll make a move on the herd soon, Hank added, his voice tight with nerves, and then Colton's voice, hard as granite. Let them try. We'll be ready. The words sent a chill down Josephine's spine. This wasn't just about cattle. She knew it. The men who were coming, they weren't common thieves. They were looking for something else. Something Lila had hidden. The next morning, Josephine watched as Colton checked his rifle, his movements precise and deadly. You expecting trouble? She asked, her voice quiet. He didn't look at her. Always, he said. He rode out without another word, leaving her standing in the doorway with flour on her hands and a cold knot of fear in her stomach. All day, she prepared. She baked extra bread, enough to feed an army. She drew bucket after bucket of fresh water. She cleaned and filled every lantern in the house, lining them up on the kitchen counter like soldiers. They were small, practical acts, A woman's way of going to war. As dusk fell, the air grew still and heavy. Wyatt and Hank rode in early, their faces grim, rifles laid across their saddles. "They'll come for the strays first," Hank muttered, his eyes never stopping their nervous scan of the hills. "Try to draw us out." Colton was the last to arrive, his horse slick with sweat. His face was an unreadable mask. He gave a sharp nod to his men, then his eyes found Josephine. "Stay inside tonight," he said. "Lock the door." It was an order, but beneath the command, she heard a tremor of fear. Not for himself, for her. Night fell like a black curtain. Josephine moved through the kitchen in the dark, her heart hammering against her ribs. She set a pot of coffee to boil on the stove, the smell filling the tense silence. She put a plate of biscuits in the warming oven. It was a strange, almost absurd preparation for violence. Then she heard it. A faint sound, carried on the night air. The muffled thud of hooves on dry earth. She blew out the single lantern, plunging the kitchen into darkness, and peered through a crack in the shutters. The moon had risen, bathing the yard in a ghostly, silver light. It was empty. For a moment. Then all hell broke loose. Shouts tore through the night. The thunder of galloping horses, the sharp, terrifying crack of a rifle. Josephine stumbled back from the window as a bullet whizzed past, shattering a pane of glass. A shadow darted across the yard, low and fast. She held her breath, her blood turning to ice. Her eyes fell on the heavy iron skillet she'd left on the stove. Without thinking, she grabbed it. The handle was still warm. It felt solid, real in her trembling hands. Footsteps scraped on the porch, the door handle rattled. "This house is watched," she called out, her voice miraculously steady. "The sheriff is on his way." It was a desperate lie. A violent shove rattled the door in its frame. She didn't hesitate. She swung the heavy skillet with all her might, smashing it against the wooden door. The clang was deafening, a raw, defiant sound. A man cursed on the other side. She heard retreating footsteps, then the frantic sound of a horse galloping away. Only then did her legs give out. She leaned against the wall, shaking, the heavy skillet still clutched in her hand. The gunfire was fading, moving off toward the corrals. She scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She lit every lantern she had prepared and placed them in the windows, a beacon in the darkness. She had to guide them home. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, she heard the sound of returning horses. Colton was first, dismounting with a weary stiffness. Then Wyatt, yelling a mix of triumph and profanity. Then Hank, his laughter shaky and high-pitched. The danger had passed. Josephine threw open the door, the warm lantern light spilling out into the yard, illuminating their exhausted, dust-caked faces. "You're back," she whispered, the words raw with relief. "We ran 'em off, ma'am." Wyatt grinned, his face split by a white slash of teeth in the darkness. "Thanks to you," Hank added, his voice full of a new, profound respect. "You lit the way home." Colton said nothing. He walked into the light, his shirt torn, a dark stain of blood on his arm. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen before. It was awe. "You held your ground," he said, his voice quiet. "I was afraid," she admitted, her own voice trembling. "Fear's no shame," he replied. "You stayed." The men ate like wolves, their exhaustion making them ravenous. Josephine moved among them, refilling coffee cups, handing out warm biscuits, her earlier fear replaced by a fierce, protective pride. When the men had finally stumbled off to their bunks, Colton remained. He stood by the stove, the lantern light catching the lines of exhaustion on his face. She saw the gash on his arm more clearly now. Without a word, she took a clean cloth and a bowl of water and began to clean the wound. He didn't pull away. He just watched her, his eyes dark and intense. "You shouldn't have faced that door alone," he said finally. "I couldn't let them in," she said softly. "I couldn't let them get what they came for." A flicker of surprise crossed his face. "What do you think they came for?" She met his gaze, her own steady and clear. "Not cattle." A strange, sad smile touched his lips. "No," he said, "not cattle." He reached out then, his calloused hand covering hers, stilling her movements. The touch was electric, a shock that jolted through her entire body. "This place," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "it's stronger with you in it." The words were a key, unlocking a part of her heart she thought had rusted shut forever. Before she could find her voice, he gently pulled his hand away. "Get some sleep, Josephine," he said, his voice soft. He turned and walked out, his boots whispering across the porch and into the night. She stood in the warm, quiet kitchen, her heart hammering not from fear, but from the terrifying, exhilarating realization that she was no longer just a cook, she was a guardian. And she knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that the fight was far from over. The men who came tonight would be back, and next time they wouldn't be scared off by an old woman with an iron skillet. Autumn came, painting the prairie in shades of gold and rust, a soft, melancholy beauty after the harshness of summer. The cattle drive was a success, and for the first time in years Colton decided the ranch would celebrate. It was more than a celebration of a good season. It was a declaration, a statement to the town and anyone else watching that the McGraw Ranch was still standing, stronger than ever. The news sent a ripple of whispers through the town, but this time they were laced with curiosity instead of just scorn. Josephine knew this supper was her stage. It was her chance to face down the gossip and claim her place, not just in the kitchen, but in this new life she was building. She worked for 2 days straight, a whirlwind of flour and smoke and fierce determination. Roasts sizzled in the oven, pies cooled on the windowsill, their sweet cinnamon scent a flag of victory. The kitchen hummed with life. When the night of the party arrived, wagons began to creak up the long drive. Neighbors she'd only seen scowling in town now approached with hesitant smiles. Even Sadie Bell came, dressed in a gown of blood-red silk, her eyes sharp and watchful, taking in the transformation of the once-dead house. Colton moved through the crowd, a quiet, solid presence, but his eyes kept finding Josephine's across the lantern-lit yard, a silent message of support. The food was a revelation. Murmurs of appreciation swelled into outright praise. Men who had once sneered at her now came back for second and third helpings of her biscuits. Sadie's smile grew thin and tight. She saw she was losing her power. As the evening wound down, Colton stood up. A hush fell over the crowd. He rested one hand on the back of a chair and let his gaze sweep over his guests until it landed on Josephine, who stood half-hidden in the doorway of her kitchen. "This house was just a place to sleep for a long time," he said, his voice low but carrying in the quiet night. "The work got done, but it wasn't a home, not until she came." He nodded toward her, a simple, powerful gesture. "Josephine Carver. She did more than keep us fed. She brought this place back to life." A stunned silence followed. Then Wyatt let out a whoop. Hank pounded the table in approval, and the applause spread, genuine and warm. Josephine stood frozen, the sound washing over her. Tears pricked her eyes. After all the whispers, all the scorn, to be seen, to be honored in this way. It cracked open something that had been locked away for years. Later, when the last wagon had rattled away, Colton found her on the porch. The night was cool and clear, the sky a black velvet cloth strewn with diamond dust. "You did more than cook tonight," he said softly. "You gave this place a heart." She couldn't speak, her throat thick with emotion. He didn't press her. Instead, he reached out and gently rested his hand over hers where she gripped the railing. It wasn't a gesture of possession. It was an offering of partnership. "I'd like you to stay, Josephine," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "Not as my cook, as my wife." The world tilted on its axis. She stared at him, speechless. This wasn't what she had come for. Revenge, Justice, answers. Yes. But love? Hope? She hadn't dared to even dream of them. Colton, You don't have to answer now, he said quickly. Just think about it. He squeezed her hand once, then retreated back into the house, leaving her alone with the stars and the impossible question. Could she let go of the past she came to avenge and build a future she never thought she'd have? The wind whispered through the dry grass, and for the first time, it didn't sound like a lament. It sounded like a promise. But as she stood there, a cold dread trickled into her heart. Sadie Bell's parting words to her as she left the party echoed in her mind. He's hiding something, you know, about Lila. Don't ever forget who you're sleeping under the roof of. Sadie's smile had been a razor blade. Josephine knew this peace was just the calm before the final, terrible storm. The truth about her daughter's disappearance was still buried, and she had a feeling the man who just proposed to her was the one holding the shovel. If you enjoyed this story of grit and unexpected justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales from the edge of the wild. You won't want to miss what happens next.